The heavy scent of incense mixed with the cold damp smell of fresh earth filled the dim room. A young boy named Yuniel carefully wiped the pale forehead of a motionless corpse. Beside him stood his grandfather, an old Undertaker with heavily scarred hands and deep, unreadable eyes. For as long as Yuniel could remember, their lives revolved around preparing the deceased for their final rest. The old man constantly told him that understanding the dead was the key to understanding the living. Yuniel learned how to trace muscles, locate vital organs, and identify precise points of fatal trauma. However, his grandfather was far more than a simple handler of the dead. Hidden beneath his loose Undertaker robes were fading tattoos of the notorious demonic Sect. In his youth, the old man had been a legendary demonic swordsman feared across the land. Having fled that brutal world, he desired nothing but a quiet, anonymous existence for his grandson. For several years, the secluded cottage in the snowy forest remained safe from the chaos of the martial world. Yuniel silently absorbed every detail of his grandfather's combat lessons, disguised as simple Undertaker routines. But the past is a ghost that refuses to stay buried forever. One freezing night, the wind carried a sudden, unnatural silence through the valley. Inside the workshop, the old man abruptly froze and gripped his rusted iron poker. He turned to Yuniel and ordered him to hide beneath the floorboards instantly. Sensing the overwhelming gravity of the situation, the boy quickly slipped into the dark crawlspace. He pulled the wooden panel closed just as the heavy front door shattered into splinters. 5 masked figures clad in dark martial robes stepped over the debris, their unsheathed swords gleaming coldly. The leader laughed mockingly, recognizing the old man despite his ragged Undertaker appearance. The old grandfather did not flinch, stepping forward to block their path into the deeper rooms. Without another word, the assassins surged forward like a pack of starving wolves. The old master unleashed a sudden burst of hidden demonic energy, moving with terrifying speed. His iron poker shattered the chest of the first attacker with a sickening crunch. Watching through the narrow cracks of the floorboards, Yuniel covered his mouth to stifle a gasp. Though the old man possessed elite skills, his aging body quickly began to betray him. The remaining 4 assassins coordinated their strikes perfectly, exploiting his slowed reflexes. A long blade sliced deeply across the old man's shoulder, staining his Undertaker robes crimson. Roaring with remaining pride, the old master swung his broken weapon and took down another foe. However, a second blade pierced straight through his back, the tip protruding from his chest. Yuniel's heart shattered as he witnessed his grandfather fall to his knees on the bloody floor. The remaining assassins coldly withdrew their weapons, leaving the old man bleeding out in the wreckage. Satisfied that their target was finished, they turned and vanished into the stormy winter night. Silence returned to the house, broken only by the sound of heavy, failing breaths. Yuniel violently pushed the floorboards open and rushed to his grandfather's side. He tried to stanch the bleeding using his Undertaker wraps, but the wounds were too deep. Raising a trembling, blood-soaked hand, the old master gently touched Yuniel's cheek one last time. With his final breath, he told Yuniel to take his secret medallion and flee to the demonic sect. The old man's eyes slowly lost their light, and his hand fell limply to the floor. Yuniel knelt alone in the silence, his grief hardening into an icy, unyielding fury. He picked up his specialized Undertaker blade, its sharp edge reflecting his burning gaze. He swore a blood oath to use his knowledge of death to slaughter every single person responsible for this night. Packing his basic anatomy tools and the demonic medallion, he stepped out into the freezing blizzard. Weeks of treacherous travel led him to the towering, jagged peaks of the Black Mountain, where the selection trials were held. Thousands of brutal candidates from across the continent gathered at the gates of the Demon Palace, eager for power. The massive iron gates creaked open, revealing a shadowy abyss that promised either absolute power or an agonizing demise. A ruthless sect elder stood on a high platform announcing that only a fraction of them would survive the first hour. As the candidates began rushing forward into the darkness, a sudden deafening mechanical roar echoed beneath their feet. Massive spiked traps violently erupted from the walls, instantly impaling the front line of unsuspecting applicants. Right in front of Yuniel, a ruthless competitor drew his blade and lunged maliciously at him to clear a path. With a lethal trap closing fast behind him and a blade flying toward his neck, Yuniel's eyes narrowed as he gripped his Undertaker knife. The sharp edge of the flying blade whistled through the freezing air directly toward Yuniel's exposed neck. Utilizing his profound knowledge of joint mechanics, the young boy bent his spine backward at an impossible angle to escape death. His short Undertaker blade deflected the secondary trap mechanism with a resonant metallic clang. Escaping the immediate ambush, Yuniel fled into the cold night with his grandfather's secret teachings burned into his memory. Days of relentless travel across treacherous mountain paths brought him to the imposing gates of the legendary Demon Palace. Thousands of ruthless martial artists from across the land gathered here with a singular desire for power. Yuniel quietly blended into the back of the crowd, his eyes scanning the physical builds of his potential rivals. A scarred elder clothed in midnight black robes stepped onto the high balcony to announce the commencement of the selection. The elder declared that only a small fraction of the applicants would survive the first physical aptitude test. Suddenly, the heavy stone floor beneath the courtyard collapsed into a massive yawning abyss. Hundreds of candidates shrieked in terror as they fell directly into the subterranean cavern below. Anticipating the drop, Yuniel relaxed his muscles completely to minimize the impact of the inevitable landing. Around him, the brutal sound of bones snapping against hard stone echoed through the darkness. Yuniel rolled forward upon impact, expertly dispersing the kinetic energy across his entire skeletal frame. A booming voice announced that the survivors had exactly 1 hour to navigate the crushing gravity corridor ahead. As the first desperate warrior stepped into the passage, a massive unseen weight forced him violently to his knees. The immense pressure within the zone increased exponentially with every single step forward. Yuniel did not rush into the corridor, choosing instead to analyze the breathing patterns of those who failed. He noted that the heavy gravity attacked the weak links in human posture, causing immediate internal bleeding. Drawing on his experience handling rigid corpses, he knew exactly how to realign his bones to withstand external load. Stepping firmly into the high-gravity zone, he felt an immediate crushing force press down on his head. His joints popped loudly under the sudden pressure, but his expression remained completely unbothered. Other candidates watched in utter disbelief as a small, seemingly frail boy walked steadily past them. By locking his skeletal structure in perfect equilibrium, he minimized the muscular energy needed to move. Halfway through the corridor, the red runes suddenly shifted to an ominous, blinding purple color. The gravity suddenly doubled in strength, causing several weak candidates to be crushed instantly into the floor. Yuniel felt his own ribs groan under the immense load, threatening to puncture his internal organs. He shifted his weight to his pelvis, utilizing the thickest bones in the body to bear the brunt of the strike. He stepped over the fresh, warm bodies of fallen candidates, completely desensitized to the gruesome sight. From the unique fractures in their limbs, he deduced exactly where the gravity waves hit hardest. He adjusted his pathing dynamically, zigzagging between the invisible focal points of pressure. A desperate candidate nearby tried to grab Yuniel's ankle to drag him down out of pure malice. Without even looking down, Yuniel brought his heel down directly on the fragile metacarpal bones of the hand. A sickening crunch echoed through the hall as the attacker screamed out in agony. Nothing would stand in the way of his ultimate oath to slaughter his grandfather's murderers. Sweat drenched his entire body, and his muscles screamed in utter protest with every inch gained. Pure determination and the memory of the bloody cabin pushed his trembling legs forward. With one final agonizing step, Yuniel crossed the threshold of the gravity zone into a wide arena. He was among the first 10 people to successfully complete the harrowing physical aptitude trial. At the center of the arena stood a massive, heavily armored candidate holding a giant notched broadsword. The giant candidate smirked at Yuniel, releasing a crushing wave of bloodlust that filled the entire chamber. The Sect elder announced that the second trial would begin immediately with no time allowed for rest. The iron gates behind the survivors slammed shut, trapping them inside the arena with the elite killers. The giant candidate swung his massive sword in a wide arc, creating a gust of wind that blew Yuniel's hair back. As the giant lunged forward with a mountain-splitting strike, Yuniel noticed a strange fresh scar on the attacker's dominant wrist. The mountain-splitting strike whistled through the heavy air as Yuniel fixed his gaze directly on that peculiar fresh scar on the attacker's dominant wrist. An old Undertaker's maxim echoed in his mind, reminding him that every scar tells a story of hidden muscular weakness and compromised agility. The giant's massive cleaver sliced a mere inch from Yuniel's nose, cutting the air with a deafening, terrifying roar. As the heavy blade embedded itself deeply into the cracked stone, the giant's right forearm flexed unevenly due to the damaged tendons underneath. Yuniel immediately pivoted on his heel, slipping into the blind spot created by his opponent's restricted rotational mobility. Around them, the selection trials had rapidly devolved into an absolute slaughterhouse as other candidates tore each other apart in desperate frenzy. Fresh corpses littered the stone tiles, providing Yuniel with a grim textbook of data regarding the current combatants' lethal habits. He noted that 3 distinct bodies nearby shared identical clean diagonal lacerations across their left carotid arteries. The giant yanked his weapon free with a spray of rock shards, realizing his small target had effortlessly evaded a certain death blow. "You run well for a rat," the brute growled, shifting his stance to prepare for a sweeping horizontal decapitation strike. Yuniel remained completely silent, his breathing perfectly synchronized to minimize any unnecessary muscle tension in his own limbs. He calculated the exact angle of the incoming sweep based on the orientation of the giant's uninjured left shoulder girdle. The massive blade swung with a violent gust of wind, seeking to sever Yuniel's torso cleanly in 2 pieces. Dropping flat to the crimson-stained stone, Yuniel let the deadly edge pass a mere hair's breadth above his spine. As he slid, he passed another fresh corpse, observing that its right clavicle had been shattered by a heavy downward blunt impact. This secondary wound confirmed that the giant habitually followed missing horizontal swings with an immediate heavy shield bash or elbow strike. Predicting the incoming trajectory perfectly, Yuniel rolled sharply to the right just as a massive iron-shod boot crushed the stone where his head had been. The shockwave of the impact vibrated through the floor, but Yuniel was already springboarding back onto his feet with fluid grace. He knew that to defeat a monster of this scale, he had to systematically destroy the biomechanical pillars that supported its massive weight. Frustrated by his continuous misses, the giant candidate unleashed a rapid flurry of chaotic overlapping slashes to corner his elusive opponent. To an untrained eye, the onslaught was an impenetrable wall of death, but to an Undertaker, it was full of predictable organic rhythms. Every time the giant swung from the right, the scar on his wrist forced a micro-delay of exactly 1/4 of a second to stabilize the blade. That tiny anatomical flaw was the golden key Yuniel required to dismantle the strongest candidate in the selection room. Instead of retreating further, Yuniel stepped directly forward into the path of the next oncoming mountain-splitting strike. From the high viewing galleries, the watching sect elders leaned forward, assuming the young boy had finally committed suicide. At the exact microsecond of the delay, Yuniel thrust his short Undertaker blade straight through the center of the giant's wrist scar. The giant roared in agonizing disbelief as the delicate tendons responsible for his grip were cleanly severed by the precise puncture. The massive cleaver slipped from his paralyzed fingers, clattering loudly across the bloody stone floor, and leaving him entirely defenseless. "Your grandfather's techniques were sloppy," Yuniel whispered coldly, utilizing his opponent's momentum to slide around behind his massive knees. With 2 swift, brutal cross lashes, he severed the Achilles tendons of both the giant's legs with practiced anatomical efficiency. The colossal warrior crashed heavily to his knees, his immense height reduced to eye level with the cold, vengeful Undertaker boy. Around them, the chaotic sounds of the secondary trial began to quiet down as fewer and fewer candidates remained standing. Yuniel placed the cold edge of his bloody short blade directly against the giant's throbbing carotid artery. "Tell me who sent the assassins to my grandfather's house, or I will dissect you while you are still conscious," he threatened smoothly. The giant trembled violently, recognizing that this boy possessed the chilling, merciless eyes of a seasoned demonic master. It was the elders of Hell Island. They wanted his secret demonic sword manual, the brute gasped out hoarsely. Yuniel absorbed the name instantly, his mind locking it away as the next definitive milestone on his absolute path of vengeance. Without a single shred of hesitation, he drew his blade across the throat, completing the perfect anatomical cut he had studied on the corpses. As the giant slumped forward into the growing pool of blood, a heavy iron horn blew from the palace towers, signaling the conclusion of the second trial. A sinister cloaked herald stepped onto the central platform, casting a cold gaze over the few battered survivors who remained standing. "Congratulations on surviving the slaughterhouse, but your true nightmare begins now," the herald announced with a chilling, distorted voice. Yuniel wiped the dark blood from his blade onto his sleeve, keeping his eyes locked onto the herald's ominous movements. "The final stage will take place on Hell Island itself, where you must survive against both monsters and each other," the herald declared. The remaining candidates exchanged uneasy glances, well aware that Hell Island was a desolate wasteland from which nobody ever returned unchanged. Suddenly, the stone floor beneath Yuniel's feet split apart into an absolute abyss, swallowing him whole into a dark, roaring vortex before he could even brace for impact. The roaring darkness consumed Yuniel as he plummeted down the endless, freezing abyss of Hell Island. His body slammed violently against a jagged outcrop of rock before he crashed heavily onto a wet, subterranean cavern floor. When he tried to open his eyes, a searing burning sensation flared through his retinas, plunging his vision into absolute pitch-black darkness. He rubbed his eyelids frantically but realized a toxic gaseous mist from the chasm had temporarily blinded him completely. The eerie sound of dripping water echoed through the cavern, amplified 1,000 times in his ears. Suddenly, the sharp rustle of soft footsteps on loose gravel betrayed the presence of unwelcome visitors hidden in the darkness. Out from the shadows crept a coordinated circle of elite Orthodox assassins, their white robes gleaming faintly in the gloom. They had infiltrated the demonic selection grounds to eliminate the surviving candidates before they could grow into true threats. Yuniel stood up unsteadily, unable to see the gleaming blade swinging silently toward his throat. A sudden blade slashed across his shoulder, drawing a spray of hot crimson blood that splattered onto the cold stone floor. In that moment of absolute peril, Yuniel forced his mind to shed the reliance on physical sight completely. He remembered his grandfather's ultimate lesson about sensing the heat and decay inherent within every living body. Suddenly, his remaining senses exploded outward, mapping the entire cavern in a vibrant grid of thermal energy and sound vibrations. The heartbeat of the closest assassin thumped loudly in Yuniel's mind like a rhythmic war drum. He could smell the distinct metallic scent of their sword steel and the salt of their anxious sweat. The primal dark beast senses deep within his lineage had finally awakened under the pressure of death. Another assassin lunged from the left, executing a high-speed piercing strike aimed directly at Yuniel's heart. Without looking, Yuniel pivoted his torso by a mere fraction of an inch, allowing the cold blade to graze harmlessly past his ribs. Before the attacker could recover, Yuniel drove his short Undertaker blade upward into the weak gap beneath the assassin's collarbone. He twisted the weapon expertly, severing the subclavian artery based on his deep anatomical knowledge of human corpses. The remaining Orthodox assassins gasped in horror as their comrade dropped dead without the blind boy even looking at him. Yuniel wiped the fresh blood off his blade using the sleeve of his dark jacket with terrifying composure. He turned his blind milk-white eyes directly toward the next target, tracking the frantic pacing of the man's breath. The two assassins panicked and rushed him simultaneously from opposite sides, unleashing a flurry of intersecting sword arcs. Moving with the predatory grace of a dark beast, Yuniel dropped flat against the ground, letting the blades clash loudly above his head. He swept his leg in a powerful circular motion, knocking the first assassin off his balance and sending him crashing down. As the fallen man hit the dirt, Yuniel lunged forward and drove his blade straight through the back of the assassin's neck. The final remaining assassin broke formation entirely, scrambling backward in absolute desperation to escape the blind demon. Yuniel stood up slowly from the corpse, tracking the fleeing footsteps with absolute precision through the vibrations in the floor. With a flick of his wrist, he launched his Undertaker blade through the air like a silver streak of lightning. The blade embedded itself deep into the fleeing assassin's spine, pinning him face first onto the cold cavern wall. Silence returned to Hell Island's abyss, broken only by the steady dripping of blood from the fresh corpses. Yuniel sank to his knees, his physical energy thoroughly depleted from the intense burst of dark beast senses. A sudden warmth surged through his eyes as the toxic blindness finally began to recede, restoring his vision with sharp clarity. He looked at his hands, now brimming with a newly awakened, refined demonic energy that resonated with his grandfather's legacy. Standing up amidst the fallen Orthodox assassins, Yuniel realized he had successfully passed the final, most brutal trial of survival. He retrieved his blade from the final corpse, feeling the absolute closure of mastering his own destiny. His grandfather's killers were still out there, but now he possessed the true strength of a demon master to hunt them down. The selection trial was over, and the demonic sect had just unleashed its most terrifying predator onto the world. With a heart steeled by vengeance and eyes that could see through the deepest darkness, Yuniel marched forward into his new reign.